A young mother in a Hadza camp in northern Tanzania watches a hunter walk in at dusk, an impala slung across his shoulders, and she is not thinking about his shoulders at all. She is thinking about the last 4 times he came back empty-handed, and the 2 times before that when he shared the kill evenly with 6 families instead of favoring his own. She is running a tally she has kept without ever writing it down. This is not romance the way we picture it. This is assessment, and it has been running in one form or another for every woman who ever lived before agriculture existed. The question of how ancient women chose partners gets flattened into a single lazy image almost everywhere it appears. A man selects. A woman is selected. Strength wins, and the rest is scenery. That picture is wrong on nearly every point that modern anthropology can actually check. Living hunter-gatherer societies, the closest working models we have for how humans paired off before farming, rearranged everything, show something closer to a negotiation with real leverage on both sides. Reconstructing exactly how that worked means combining 3 separate lines of evidence: direct ethnographic study of foraging peoples like the Hadza, the Aceh of Paraguay, and the Juhoansi of the Kalahari, comparative research on our closest primate relatives, and genetic data pulled from the DNA of people alive right now. None of it is guesswork stacked on guesswork. Each piece checks the others. If this is already landing, subscribe and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Start with the most basic biological fact, because it explains why any of this mattered in the first place. Human infants are catastrophically helpless for years, not months. A chimpanzee mother can carry and feed her infant largely alone. A human mother historically could not. This single difference reshaped the entire mating landscape of our species. Anthropologist Owen Lovejoy proposed in 1981 that pair bonding in humans evolved specifically around this problem. Males who stuck around and provisioned a mate and her offspring left more surviving descendants than males who mated and moved on. The theory is decades old now and still debated on the details, but the core insight holds up. Human pair bonding isn't a cultural invention layered onto animal instinct. It's closer to a survival technology, and food is at the center of it. Which means the first and most measurable criterion ancient women were selecting for was reliable provisioning, not hunting prowess as spectacle, reliability. Among the Aceh, studied for decades by anthropologists Kim Hill and Magdalena Hurtado, hunting success varies enormously between men, and that variance gets tracked socially in real time. A man whose kills feed multiple families consistently, year after year, occupies a completely different social and reproductive position than a man who hunts rarely or shares poorly. The Aceh data shows children of the most successful hunters had measurably better survival odds in childhood. That's not folklore. That's a documented mortality curve. Here's where it gets genuinely complicated, and worth sitting with the complication rather than smoothing it away. Anthropologist Kristen Hawk spent years studying Hadza hunting, and noticed something that didn't fit the simple provisioning story. Men frequently hunted large, difficult, low-probability game, animals that might feed the whole camp if the hunt succeeded, over small, reliable game they could catch consistently to feed just their own family. Hawks proposed the show-off hypothesis, that big game hunting functioned partly as costly signaling, a public demonstration of skill and generosity that raised a man's status and access to multiple mates, rather than a strictly efficient food-gathering strategy. Other researchers, including Frank Marlowe in his own extensive Hadza fieldwork, found real support for connections between hunting reputation and marital opportunities, but the picture stayed messy. Good hunters in some studies had more affairs and more marriages over a lifetime. They didn't always have dramatically more surviving children. Researchers still argue over exactly how much of hunting behavior was about feeding a family, and how much was about being seen feeding everyone else's. What both sides of that argument agree on is the part that matters most here. Women were watching, tracking, and factoring hunting reputation directly into who they married and how long they stayed married. That's active female evaluation, not passive selection from a shrinking pool of leftover options. Provisioning wasn't the only axis. Temperament mattered just as much, and in some datasets more. Cross-cultural fieldwork among foraging societies consistently surfaces the same handful of qualities women describe wanting in a partner: even temper, non-violence toward the woman and her children, willingness to share food beyond his immediate obligations, and demonstrated cooperation with the wider camp rather than just his own kin line. A skilled hunter with a violent temper or a stingy hand routinely lost out to a modestly skilled hunter who shared generously and stayed calm. Anthropologist Sarah Blaffer Hrdy has argued extensively that human child-rearing was cooperative from very early in our evolutionary history, meaning a mother's survival and her children's survival depended on a whole network, not one man alone. A partner who threatened that network's cohesion through cruelty or hoarding was a liability regardless of his hunting numbers. If this video is giving you something to think about, subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep making content like this. Now bring in something that gets almost no attention outside specialist journals. How easy it was in most documented foraging societies for a woman to simply leave. Divorce among the Hadza is common, low conflict by modern standards, and carries little permanent social stigma for either party. A woman dissatisfied with a partner's provisioning, temperament, or treatment of her children could and did walk. Anthropological surveys of the Hadza put lifetime rates of marital separation strikingly high compared to industrialized societies, and remarriage afterward was neither rare nor shameful. This detail matters enormously for the larger question, because a choice that can't be revised isn't really a choice. Ancient women weren't selecting a partner once and living with the consequences forever. They were running an ongoing evaluation, with an actual exit available if the evaluation turned negative. Kinship networks complicated the picture without eliminating female agency. In many foraging societies, a woman's mother, sisters, and broader female kin network played an active advisory role in partner selection, sometimes a decisive one. This wasn't women being overruled by male relatives so much as women consulting a support system built from other women who had run this exact calculation before. Marriage in many of these societies also created alliance ties between family groups, meaning a union carried social and economic weight beyond the two individuals involved. A woman's choice was rarely made in total isolation, but it also wasn't made for her by men trading her like property. Those are two very different pictures, and the ethnographic record consistently supports the first one over the second. There's a genetic thread running through all of this that deserves real attention, because it offers something the ethnographic record alone can't: a signature written directly into the DNA of billions of living people. Population geneticists studying the ratio of genetic diversity carried on the Y chromosome, passed strictly father to son, against diversity carried in mitochondrial DNA, passed strictly mother to child, can estimate how many men versus how many women actually reproduced across deep history. For most of the deep hunter-gatherer past, that ratio looks close to even. Something shifted dramatically later, during the Neolithic period after agriculture and inherited property took hold. A 2018 study led by geneticist Tian-Chen Zheng, published in Nature Communications, found evidence of a sharp bottleneck in Y chromosome diversity roughly 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, consistent with a period where a small number of men fathered a disproportionate share of children, while female reproductive diversity stayed comparatively broad. Researchers still debate the precise mechanism, whether it reflects intensified male-male conflict over resources, the rise of polygyny concentrated among wealthy lineages, or some combination, but the pattern itself is well documented across multiple independent studies. Before that shift, the genetic signature is consistent with something closer to widespread, distributed pair bonding rather than a handful of men monopolizing reproduction. That single genetic fact reframes everything discussed so far. The image of ancient men competing violently to monopolize women, harems, and conquest describes something that mostly hadn't happened yet in the deep hunter-gatherer past. It describes what happened later, after farming created concentrated wealth and inheritable property worth fighting over. For the overwhelming majority of the time our species has existed, the genetic evidence points toward a system where most men and most women both reproduced, which only makes sense in a world where women held real and exercised choice. Physical appearance mattered too, though the specifics are considerably harder to pin down than popular science articles tend to suggest. Researchers studying cross-cultural mate preferences have found signals of health and fertility, clear skin, symmetrical features, certain body proportions, showing up as attractive across many different cultural contexts, which suggests some evolved component to attraction beyond pure cultural conditioning. But the specific claims about universal ratios and precise numerical preferences that circulated widely in the 1990s and 2000s have faced serious methodological criticism since, and the honest current position among researchers is that physical cues mattered, interacted heavily with local cultural context, and were nowhere close to the dominant factor that provisioning ability, temperament, and social standing represented in daily foraging life. A body can't hunt for you. A body can't stay calm when the camp runs short of food for 2 weeks straight. Ancient women, by every line of evidence available, weighted the traits that actually predicted a partner's long-term behavior far more heavily than the traits that just predicted a partner's appearance on a given afternoon. Put all of this together and the turn becomes clear. The old assumption treats mate choice in deep history as something that happened to women, a passive filtering process shaped entirely by male competition and female availability. The actual evidence points the other direction. Women were running continuous, socially embedded evaluations of provisioning reliability, temperament, cooperative behavior, and community standing, with real leverage to walk away if the evaluation failed, real support from kin networks in making that judgment, and a genetic signature in the population record that only makes sense if a wide range of men, not a narrow elite, were actually being chosen. The Hadza mother watching that hunter walk into camp with the impala isn't a bystander in her own reproductive history. She's the one holding the ledger. What changed wasn't female judgment. It was the world that judgment operated in. Agriculture introduced land that could be inherited, surplus that could be hoarded, and status that could be locked in across generations rather than earned fresh through daily hunting success. Once wealth became fixed and inheritable, a small number of men could accumulate enough of it to concentrate reproduction in their own hands, regardless of what any individual woman might have preferred, and the genetic bottleneck in the record shows exactly that shift taking hold. The deep hunter-gatherer past wasn't a golden age free of coercion or constraint. It carried its own dangers and inequalities. But on the specific question of who got to choose, the evidence keeps pointing toward women holding more functional say over their own reproductive lives before farming than for long stretches of the thousands of years that followed it. A grandmother sitting at the edge of the same Hadza camp is easy to overlook in this story, and that is a mistake researchers have made themselves, more than once. Kristen Hawkes and her colleagues spent years studying not just hunting but a much quieter figure. Postmenopausal women who kept working, kept gathering tubers and berries, kept feeding grandchildren long after their own fertility ended. The grandmother hypothesis, developed from that fieldwork, argues that human menopause itself evolved because older women who redirected their energy toward grandchildren, rather than continuing to bear children of their own, increased the survival odds of their existing lineage more effectively than continued childbearing would have. This detail matters here because it changes the shape of the whole selection story. A woman's mate choice wasn't made in a vacuum bounded only by herself and a partner. It was made inside a support structure that included her mother and grandmother, women whose labor was actively subsidizing the survival of her children regardless of which man she chose. A woman with strong grandmother support could afford to weigh a partner's temperament and reliability more heavily, because she wasn't entirely dependent on his provisioning to keep a child alive. That safety net gave her leverage, and leverage is exactly what turns a constrained decision into a genuine choice. Gift-giving deserves its own mention too, because it shows up across an enormous range of documented foraging and small-scale societies as a specific, trackable courtship behavior, rather than a vague cultural universal. Among several South American and African foraging groups studied by anthropologists, men gave meat, tools, ornaments, or labor directly to a woman's family well before any formal union was recognized, and the pattern, frequency, and generosity of those gifts functioned as a visible, ongoing signal that could be evaluated and compared. This wasn't a single transaction that sealed a deal. It was a sustained courtship period during which a woman and her female kin could watch a man's behavior accumulate into a pattern, exactly the kind of long-run reliability signal that a single afternoon of hunting prowess could never fully substitute for. A man who gave generously once but stopped afterward revealed something different than a man whose giving held steady for months. Ancient women, by every account anthropologists have reconstructed, were reading that difference closely. Body adornment complicates the picture in an interesting direction as well. Archaeological finds of deliberately shaped ochre, pierced shell beads, and worked ivory ornaments dating back tens of thousands of years show that self-presentation and display were already part of human social life well before recorded history begins. Some of these ornaments appear on both male and female remains in the archaeological record, suggesting display wasn't a one-directional performance aimed only at attracting a mate, but a broader social signal of group identity, status, and skill. A man capable of trading for or crafting fine beadwork was demonstrating access to distant trade networks and resources, information a woman's family could reasonably fold into their assessment of his broader capability and connections, not just his hunting arm. None of these additional threads, the grandmother's labor, the accumulating pattern of gifts, the trade network signal carried in a string of beads, replace the central picture already laid out. They reinforce it. Every one of them describes a woman, and the women around her, running a slow, careful, socially supported evaluation of a man's actual long-term behavior rather than reacting to a single dramatic display. The deeper the evidence gets excavated, the less room there is for the old passive selection story to survive intact. Thank you for watching. More videos are on your screen now, and if you haven't already, subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.